Members, good evening. It's just a tiny bit after 7:15, so I think we will start. Please, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for being here, and welcome to anybody watching on the Council's YouTube channel. This meeting of the Local Plan Subcommittee, 15th of May. Apologies for absence. I have just a few. Councillor Bowers, who's being substituted by Councillor Holland, Councillor Bowers-Flint, who's substituted by Councillor Prime, and Councillor Butland, who's substituted by Councillor Schwer. I will just say that both Councillor Bowers and Councillor Bowers-Flint have COVID, which, I wish them well and hope they'll get better very soon. And we are expecting Councillor Walsh, I think, who may have been, I don't know if he's been held up in traffic, but wait. All right, thank you. We are expecting him. Right, everybody else is here. Could I have any declarations of interest, please, to declare the existence and nature of any disclosable pecuniary interest or other registrable interest relating to items on the agenda having regard to the Code of Conduct for members and where you've taken appropriate advice if necessary? No? Right, good, thank you. Item 3, minutes of previous meeting. We've had the minutes of the last meeting held on the 14th of April. They have been circulated. We looked at the results of the issues and options consultation and also Gypsy and Traveller site assessment. Does anybody have any comments or questions on those? If not, could I have a mover, please? Somebody to move, Councillor Cunningham, and a second, Councillor Ritchie, and a show of hands of approval. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Alison. Right, okay. Next item, public question time. I've nobody registered to speak under this item. In fact, nobody registered to speak this evening. Just before we move on to the main agenda items, just a couple of things from me. I know that members have received emails from governance in the last day or two about a slight change to the meeting schedule. If I could just give you a reminder, we now have an additional meeting on October the 1st, which is going to be to look at the large sites. We are also looking at those on the 24th of September, but given the amount of information needed, we felt it was wise to split that and have a second meeting, unless we wanted to pull an all-nighter in Causeway House on the 24th of September, which I'm quite sure we don't want to do. So we have an additional meeting Wednesday, October the 1st, and the 30th of October meeting has now been moved to Thursday, 6th of November. That is largely because that original date clashed with half term, and we felt not just for officers but also members of the committee that might impact on attendance for those who've got children or grandchildren. So rather than risk having people not being able to attend, we thought it was a good idea to move it to the 6th of November. And that meeting is going to be, I think, particularly important because it will be to review the entire draft plan and the decisions that we will be making over the next few months before we go out to the Reg 18 consultation. So it's important that we get as many people here as possible. And one other thing, and this is a comment from me, not from officers, I just would like to remind everyone we have got a housing target to make. It's been set by government and it's mandatory, so we don't have a choice on that. And if we were to present a local plan to the inspectorate next year, which is our intended timeline, and it demonstrably shows that we fall short of that target, I think you can be quite certain that an inspector will reject it fairly quickly. That leaves this district at risk of not having an approved local plan in place. And that gives an added risk of us not being in a position to make our own decisions about where we want to see development throughout the district, because the government have made it very plain that they expect all local authorities to have an approved local plan in place. So I've no doubt that we've got some quite difficult decisions maybe to make over the next few months with the call for sites meetings, but just to bear in mind, we've got a housing target to make, and we need to make best efforts to try and achieve that. All right. Good. Okay. I think we can crack on with the agenda. So we move to item 5. The first item, which is the draft spatial strategy, and that is going to be presented by Alan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Spree. The purpose of this report is to consider if the existing local plan spatial strategy continues to be appropriate in the context of the review of the existing local plan. I'm sure members are aware that the current strategy concentrates growth around the main towns and the A12 Great Eastern Main Line corridor. This strategy was based on a provision of 716 homes per year. However, the figure is likely to rise significantly. The report before you sets out the key characteristics of each of the larger towns, as well as areas along the A12, A120 and other parts of the district. The current spatial strategy does not contain any standalone settlement options, but the report does suggest that this is kept under review until further evidence based on the matter is available. As it stands, the current strategy hierarchy should continue as set out in table 3.23, with the identification of the main towns of Braintree, Witham and Howsted, as well as the key service villages listed in the table. It's important for members to remember that this will be the spatial strategy will be kept under review as we go through the process. It could be subject to change, additions or removals, and yes, it will have to be based on evidence, and I admit some of that evidence isn't available yet, but that will be reported to members in due course. And yes, we will have to meet our identified housing requirements as set out by the National Planning Policy Framework. Thank you. I've got nothing else to add on that, Councillor Spree. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Right, members, anybody like to speak? Councillor Abbott first, and then Councillor Coleridge.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yes, I think we all take on board your comments about the numbers game, but that then brings me on to a point I want to make, and then I've got a couple of questions. The numbers we're talking about, 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 a year, these are historically very high if you look back over what the district's built over the decades. You're right at the top end, in fact you're beyond the top end with the higher figure. So then there's a question about deliverability. It's a fact that in the last 17 years, which is roughly the horizon we're looking at to 2041, there have been 3 recessions. So the likelihood is, unless we're very lucky, there'll be at least one before 2041. And so that brings me to my first question is, under this current government, what do we know about us simply not being able to deliver the houses, not because they're not in the local plan, because they're not being built? So that's, and what would the government then do to us? Second question is on paragraph 314. It talks about coalescence, particularly in respect to Rivenhall and Haffer Peveril. Do officers know if that is a subjective matter or an objective matter? Because the gaps between Witham and both of those villages has closed progressively for many years, and in the case of Rivenhall is in effect gone in terms of some parts of the parish are already now right up against houses in Witham. So whilst totally agreeing we want to avoid coalescence, is that defined in any way? Paragraph 315 says that Witham is a good location for growth, but paragraph 313 says it's already congested. As anyone who lives or knows Witham well, peak time, the traffic is backing up for long distances. So I just wondered how those two statements gel, because if we're going to add thousands more houses to Witham, by definition, unless we're going to do something really radical with transport, we're going to get even more congestion. Paragraph 320 talks about the gap between Witham and Braintree and says that a number of villages which it names are not suitable for high levels of growth, including Cressing, which is slightly ironic because that's doubled in size in the last 10 years. It doesn't mention Silver End. Can officers please say whether it should do? And finally, a bit of a provocative question, but I'm going to make it anyway. A press release went out from the council saying that officers had identified 22 sites. Should that have been that specific? Because we as members of the local plan committee don't know what these 22 sites are. And there is a process we've got to go through. So could we have a bit of a response on that, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Abbott. Yes, I'll let officers come back on all of those. I may be wrong, but I think the point on the press release was that we've had over 300 sites submitted and, 22, which is a very small percentage of that, have been identified, well, as recommendations from officers for inclusion. Obviously, the committee decides, and there's a lot of consultation to go through. I think maybe it was just to suggest to people that because we've had 300 sites submitted doesn't mean to say that we're going to have a whole mass put in the plan. But I take your point. Anyway, Alan, Sarah, would you like to come back on those?
Okay, yeah, happy to. What happens if the sites aren't being delivered? Yes, it does strike me as unfair. Local planning authorities are required to provide all this housing. However, we have absolutely no power to ensure that they are delivered. We would obviously, when the local plan is submitted and examined, it will need to demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing. So that's one of the key things we need to do. And then general areas of growth moving forward. There is still a requirement to review the local plan every 5 years. So it will most likely be reviewed again before 2033. I don't know when the next recession will happen or how bad it will be. We are measured on 2 targets, so 5-year supply and also housing delivery test. The 5-year supply one is the more difficult one to prove because it involves looking forward into the future as what may happen. Housing delivery test shows what we've actually achieved, and as an authority we've always scored very well on our housing delivery test. The next point, coalescence, it depends on the evidence, landscape evidence, topography, things like that. Some areas you will need a wider gap than others, depending on, what the landform is like. So we have commissioned some evidence based on landscape fringes. It's not available as yet. But we have asked them to specifically look at the issue of green buffers, so we will have suitable evidence available for members when that comes forward. Yes, we do say Witham is a good location for growth, and we have to acknowledge that it is congested. We say it's a good location for growth because it has local employment, it has services, shops, things like that. But yeah, perfectly happy to acknowledge that yes, there is also congestion. Our local plan does have to be supported by a transport evidence base. That will tell us what we would need to do to either minimise that congestion, whether that is improvements in specific areas or whether we have to look at a more of a modal type shift approach where we have to encourage people out of their cars onto other types of transport, or whether it's just a case of ensuring that there's sufficient future growth within Witham to make sure that it can meet its own needs and perhaps reduce the need to travel. These are all questions that we are currently looking at. I think the reference there was to the area between sort of west of the B1018 rather than Silver End itself. So I don't think we would need to include Silver End unless you had a particular desire to include Silver End in that. We may recall that Silver End used to be a key service village but was designated through the last local plan because of a lack of services. Although admittedly, yes, it is a lot better served than somewhere like White Notley, somewhere like that. So yeah, and I think we've already touched on the matter of the press release. So.
Did I get that about right on the press release? It was to sort of, I think, probably allay people's fears that 300 sites have been submitted and they're all going to go in. Yeah. Just before I go to the speakers, if anybody had asked me to put money on one subject that will come up tonight, I'm sure it won't be the last time. It would have been on transport and the A12 and the A120. I think, you know, it is an ongoing issue, and it's largely out of our hands because we're waiting for government to pronounce on what we can and can't do and what they will or won't fund. Just on the Silver End thing, would there be an issue about putting Silver End? Are you particularly keen, Councillor Howard, to see Silver
I
End
think it was
in there?
more that everyone else was mentioned. Culture was mentioned, Kelvin and Fearing, Cressing, Braintree, Whittam, Rivenall. And to me, that the space between Whittam and Braintree does include Silver End. But I know where the piece was coming from, because it was talking about the transport corridor of the railway line. But being suspicious, it just worried me that it wasn't being mentioned one way or the other. And again, Silver End's taken a huge amount of development.
I think I might say, without wanting to sort of cause any concern, the Silver End is probably more likely to be considered in the A120 corridor when you look at the potential for the Route 4 option. Not that we have any information that would ever happen or is going to happen. So I think maybe it might fit a little bit better there. But either way, I'm quite happy to include a reference to Silver End. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Right, Councillor Coleridge and then Councillor Ritchie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I might be being chairlish on this point, but on 3.12, it advises that Whittam has a reasonable retail offer. And any of my colleagues that live in or around Whittam, whilst it is well served by supermarkets, the actual retail offering within the town is quite poor. It doesn't have really any clothing retailers. There's plenty of units available, but not actually much of a delivery. And it is also conspicuous on how few major national retailers are present in the town. So I wonder if we could change that from has a reasonable retail offering to has the potential to have a reasonable retail offering.
I think that's, well, sounds like a fair point to me. Yes, Alan, would you like to?
Yeah, I think I'm
come back
quite
on
happy
that?
to include that. I mean, Whittam is sort of very close to Chelmsford and Colchester, and it's on the main line as well. So there's obviously that draw to London, which can, obviously take away potential customers from the town centre. Our retail study didn't indicate any significant additional need for retail floor space pretty much in the entire district, other than what you would need to support, say, through local shops at a larger growth location. But I think we could say potential.
Yes, I know. We looked at the retail study, I think, meeting before last, didn't we? But I think for the sake of adding that one word, I think that's not unreasonable. Yeah, that's fine. Councillor Ritchie.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just to share a couple of thoughts, and again, I find myself agreeing a little bit with what Councillor Abbott has to say around housing delivery numbers. I think the spatial strategy has to lend itself to trying at every opportunity to get the decisions around infrastructure first that supports the higher housing target. It was always the philosophy of infrastructure first when we were considering garden communities. And I think when you're aiming for a higher delivery number target, as is before us now, I think at every opportunity we have to pressure and lobby to ensure that the infrastructure is there that supports sustainable growth. I think it's the only way we're going to be able to reach those targets. Secondly, I think at every opportunity we have to try and get the government to demonstrate how they will assist local planning authorities in getting house builders and developers to build out properties. I think if we took, as a planning committee members will probably know this, if we took the total sum number of applications that we have approved as a local planning authority and calculated those total numbers, it would probably well exceed our current target for housing numbers in the district. But developers are simply sitting on those planning consents and not building out. And that's where the unfair tilted balance is. Why should we be punished for not meeting our housing numbers if we are consenting the applications that are coming through planning committee and the houses are simply not being built? It's unfairly tilted to the detriment of local planning authorities, to those who sit on planning committees and officers that put in the work to get these approvals to us and approved. So I think at every opportunity within the local plan refresh, we need to try and get the inspector and those who are the decision makers in government to think about how this can be fairly applied across those who are working in local planning authorities and the house builders. This isn't just about the bottom line and the profits for house builders. If they want to deliver these types of housing numbers across the whole of the country, there has to be a shift in how governments work with housing developers and property developers to allow us to achieve some of these numbers. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Ritchie. Yes, I mean, infrastructure, ideally, we like to see it first before development start, but at the very least, when development at a very early stage, it is so important. And it has long been a bone of contention, particularly those of us on the planning committee, that we give permission and wait and don't see development starting. And it is very frustrating when you are trying your best to meet housing targets. We have lobbied government over a number of years. I've lost count of the number of letters I've written to various secretaries of state about this, to say, could they please do something, apply some pressure on developers, some way of encouraging, forcing almost them to, you know, to get spades in the ground. And I don't think we've seen a great deal of progress on that to date. It would be really helpful to have that support. And, you know, if they are going to increase housing targets, not just for this authority, but all around the country, they really could do with giving us a bit of a helping hand on that. Yeah, thank you. All right, anybody else? Yes, Councillor Parker and then Councillor Schwer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think the spatial strategy is broadly correct, and obviously nothing really has changed from our previous spatial strategy, and I think that broadly is correct. The only thing I would say is that it is very difficult for us to plan housing delivery or granting planning permission, to put it more accurately, without knowing where the major transport routes are going to go, particularly whether the A12 is actually going to go ahead and whether the A120 is ever going to be dual, the rest of it, and where, if it is, where it is going to go. And I note that in the reference to the report there is reference to the A120 corridor. Well, it's I'm not sure how else officers can describe it in this report, but at the moment we don't actually know where that corridor is. I mean, there is a current A120 corridor, but will the A120 corridor be somewhere else in 15 years' time? And if we are trying to allocate sites that are in sustainable locations, it makes it very difficult for us to try and work out where the most appropriate place for them to go. And I appreciate that's, I mean, it's just a sort of comment. There's nothing we can do about that. We just want to emphasise how difficult you know, the situation is for us. The only other thing I would make, and I'm conscious there are two members here from Halstead, and I don't want to steal in their thunder or anything, but at Halstead, the school doesn't have a sixth form, so there are educational facilities, but there's no sixth form. So children post 16, and I will call them children, you know, do have to travel out either to Colchester or to lesser extent to Headingham, and I think also to Braintree, and rely on quite not great public transport to get there. So that is a problem. I mean, there's no large supermarket in Halstead, and there is only one doctor's surgery. So whilst it is obviously one of our major towns, it is quite suffering from some lack of. And I think probably of all the towns, it's the one with the least level, the poorest level of infrastructure. Having said that, it is one of our 3 downs. As the only comments, Madam Chairman, rather than questions.
Yeah, Sainsbury's might take issue with your comment about supermarkets in Halstead, and we do have Tesco coming in, and we've got a Lidl as well. But I know what you mean. Alan, did you want to? I don't know if there's anything on there you wanted to come back on at all.
I think I'll just touch on the points about the routes A12, A120. Obviously, the DCO for the A12 was approved, but the financing is yet to be confirmed at the through the spending review. If it comes along that financing has disappeared and we've decided to put a majority of our growth in the A12, we'll have to reassess that. The A120 corridor is a little bit uncertain east of Braintree. It could shift. But west of Braintree, it's a little bit more certain. Well, there's 2 things certain about west of Braintree. One, it's a dual A120 already, and 2, you'll get stuck at Galleys Corner at 6 o'clock. So there are those certainties we have. So yes, as I said, I think earlier that we will continue to. This whole process has to continue to be reviewed as we move forward, and as further information and evidence becomes available. So unfortunately, there are quite a few uncertainties at the moment. So.
Right, thank you. Councillor Schwer.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman. I just wanted to really comment about 321 and north of the district. And I generally agree with comments about the strategic level of the key service villages and main towns, but I am a little bit concerned about villages and the rural communities in general across the north of the district, because quite frequently through the strategy we are seeing about sustainable means is limited. There has been a modal shift in the last 5 years with regards to sort of technology, and most of our vehicles are changing to either hybrids or electric, so it kind of in a way negates the argument about sustainable transport. And we even have Digigo here in Braintree now going and pushing out to rural areas to Saffron Walden. So that is going to change, and we are talking about the refresh of the plan from sort of 32 up to 40 or thereabouts. And also we're talking about still having this attitude of having main towns as the main centre of employment. Well, that may be for sort of logistics and manufacturing, but it's actually not true in a way, because again of the modal shift of people actually being employed and at home, and digital advances has enabled that. So we're actually having high levels of employment actually in rural areas as well, and it's feasible that this is going to be difficult if we don't allow some growth, because we all know that some of the village and rural facilities are finding it difficult because of the restrictions to strategic plans. And I do feel that there is a case for allowing some growth in rural areas to accommodate all the things that I've just mentioned, apart from the opportunity of those and the sense of place. Because as a result of the local plan, while there's been adequate growth in the main villages and key service villages, I feel that a lot of the rural communities are losing their sense of the place because of the infilling that is now full. And I think there is an opportunity, or I think there could be an opportunity to allow a little bit of growth to support all of the churches, the primary schools and the villages and everything that goes on. So I'd just like to mention that. I appreciate, because I know probably the officers will come back and say, well, there'll be a 5-year review, but I think there's been a modal shift in the consideration of what life is like going forward, and I think we need to take that into account a little bit.
Thank you, Councillor Schreier. I think that's a very good point. Small amounts of growth to keep things sustainable in the villages is not unreasonable. Alan, you want to come back
It's
on
an
that?
approach supported by the NPPF, so that's fine.
Councillor Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is also about, in my case, northern settlements. In creating a spatial strategy, do we take into consideration prospective developments in adjacent local plans which are being refreshed? And the one in particular that interests me at this point is Bures, which of course is half in Suffolk, half in Braintree district, half in Baber district. And my understanding is that Baber is looking to put quite significant numbers of houses compared to previous development levels at Bures, St Mary's. And my question is, do we collaborate on a level that allows us to take such things into account in developing our own spatial strategy? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Holland.
Yes, we do. We do cooperate with the other authorities through the duty to cooperate. If there is significant growth proposed outside of our boundary, we would have to take that into account. So if there were, say, some significant housing developments at Bure St Mary, we might have to assess the impact of that development on any development proposals we might want to do on our side of the border. So it's very much a case of we will meet and discuss these proposals with our neighbours, and if there's any cross-boundary impacts, we'll work together to address those impacts. And we can take into account services being available across the border as well. So that some of the northern areas are most likely going into Sudbury to access certain things, or into Haverhill. Things like that, so we can look at those that as well. So.
Okay, thank you. Right. Anyone else want to speak? Don't see any more hands up. So thank you, members. So we have recommendations on page 5. I am just going to read through them quickly because I think it's important. So recommend 2.1 that the broad spatial strategy for the district should continue to concentrate development around the main urban areas, including Braintree, Witham and Halstead, key service villages and the A12 East Anglian rail line, and include reference to the A120 corridor. That consideration of the option for new standalone settlements and large-scale urban extensions is assessed and, if appropriate, considered for inclusion in the spatial strategy at a later stage. And 2.3, that the broad framework within this report be used to determine the likely locations for the allocation of growth in the district. And I think we had at least one amendment to one addition, which was on Silver End. Have I missed any? Were there any more? Oh, Witham, yes, changed the wording there, just the potential for a retail provision, right. So, could I have somebody to move that, please? Councillor Ritchie, I think you were first, and a seconder, Councillor Prime. Just beat Councillor Parker to it. Can I have a show of hands to approve that, please? Thank you, members, that's unanimous. Right, okay. Move on to the next agenda item, item 6, which is to review the housing numbers. Alan.
Okay, thank you very much. So the purpose of this report is to consider how many homes the new local plan will need to be based on. Currently, government states that the standard housing method should be considered as your starting minimum. This would mean that as a minimum we would need to provide an additional 1,115 homes per year over 15 years. We have to do some additional work as well on things like strategic housing market assessments to potentially identify other uses, and to account for this and to account for fluctuations in the standard methodology, we're proposing to add 10% onto that figure. So we would be looking at 1,227 homes per year. We do have a number of sites already identified in the local plan. So this higher figure will mean that up to 2041 we will need to provide an additional somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 new homes. As I mentioned earlier, yes, it is very important that we still, when we get the plan to examination, that we can demonstrate the 5-year supply as well. So that first tranche of housing is the most important. Our current draft strategic housing land assessment and our call for sites exercise shows us that we have suitable or certainly sufficient numbers of housing sites to actually meet that need. The report contains a series of graphs which aim to show what we need to do in terms of providing additional housing. The first graph, the top line is the 1227 figure, the line below that is the 1115 figure, and the green line is the sites that are currently identified in our existing local plan, and the blue line halfway up the graph is our current housing target of 716 per year. So as you can see, with the increase in housing target, we are going to need to identify a relatively short amount of time quite a few. Well, I say quite a few, sort of in the region of 20 to 25 sites potentially. If we look at the second graph, with the sites we have as a draft, which would obviously require member approval or approval of this committee, and 2 rounds of consultation and additional evidence base to support them, we should be able to provide a 5-year supply. Then obviously members will notice that the supply does tail off again relatively quickly. And what that means is that post sort of 2030, we're going to be looking at needing to provide an additional 400, then an additional 700 minimum new completions per year to get us through to the end of the plan period. So we'll probably, the 5-year supply situation, I think, is probably the easiest part to deal with, subject to them actually being delivered. But there are going to have to be some significant decisions made to potentially get the local plan suitable in the longer term. Obviously, bear in mind that the plan, as I said earlier, is reviewed every 5 years. So there is a chance to sort of look at the options and see what is and isn't delivering and what we might need to change. So yes, it's quite a daunting graph. I'm quite aware of that. So yes, but as I say, the standard method does change as well. So while it is currently 1,115 per year, it changes twice a year, which is a little bit unhelpful for us. When the housing stock numbers are released and when the affordability ratios are released. So at the moment it's currently down a little bit to about 1106, but when the housing stock figures are released, that should be any time now, it'll probably just go back up to 1115 or thereabouts. Once we submit for examination, that figure will get frozen for 2 years. So yes, there is a little bit of certainty for the examination period. But it's something as I say, we will need to keep reviewing, keep an eye on it and see how it's doing, also how it's delivering. And when we review the plan in 5 years' time, we can again sort of look at our options and reassess it. Okay, so I think the recommendation is in the report to Councillor Spray. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for what I think is a very clear and understandable report, because housing numbers, it's not easy to understand whether you're involved in planning or not, or however long you've been involved in planning. It's not the easiest thing to work out. So thank you. Good report. Right. Members, anybody? Councillor Parker.
Just a couple of questions on Chair. Just with the graphs on projected delivery, the green line, existing allocations, presumably that includes sites which weren't actually allocated but have been given planning permission because we never finally had enough time.
Yes, it does.
Correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought so. And then just in paragraph 3.18 on page 14. So there's a gap that we need to find between 6,247 and 7,927. That's quite a large 2,500 odd difference. Could you just explain why there is such a large sort of range?
Yeah, so that should be the difference between the 1115 and the 1227. We are talking a period of over 15 years. So in a way it is a little bit self-inflicted why there is a large gap there, because it's the additional sort of 10% that's been identified. So that's what that is there. But if you do also notice the graph that the 700 completions per year doesn't quite meet the top line yet. So there's still a little bit of uncertainty, but I think everything is expressed as sort of an average, but we still have to consider 5-year supply and demonstrating that.
Right, thank you. Anyone at Councillor Abbott?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Well, I'll ditto the earlier item. I won't say the words again, but it's the same historical context. And looking at those graphs, it's not that many years ago we were in the low hundreds of delivery, and if that happens again through no fault of our own, we could be looking at being nearly 1,000 houses a year down on what we're supposed to be delivering through no fault of our own. I can see a car crash coming, because if we don't get a recession between now and 2041, great. But history tells us we just might. My question, though, relates to phasing. The email that came round from Sarah on the 9th of May, the first paragraph says, the review of Braintree District's local plan is looking at growth options post-2033 through to 2041, which give one interpretation of that is we're looking at sites which would be built in that period. Now, I know in the previous local plan we looked at phasing, and I think in the end we dropped all phasing. I remember we were looking at it for a time. Am I right in thinking that once these sites are in the local plan in 26, 27, they'll be eligible to come forward then, not post 2033? In other words, or have we got some ability to say, well, we're going to allocate you this 1,000 house site here, but you can't build it till 2034? I don't think we can we?
Sarah, if you want to, or, well, I don't know, or Alan, I don't mind.
I can deal with the point on phasing. Yeah, we did try phasing in the core strategy in 2011. That did eventually get dropped. There were some quite significant changes at the time in national government policy, which resulted in our housing land supply requirement going up quite considerably. If we were to phase through a policy, I think it would have to be for an infrastructure delivery reason, rather than us wanting to save houses till later. I mean, we do have a number of strategic growth locations that are currently unphased, but are still taking quite some time to come forward for other reasons. So I think there will be a fair amount of self-phasing, as it were. But it's an approach we've tried before. It didn't really get us anywhere, and if members remember the core strategy, the last phased site, I believe, was the Forest Road growth location, and that one ended up coming forward first. Once the phasing was removed, because of the size of it and how quickly they could turn it around. But yeah, it was most likely if our infrastructure or some other issue says that we couldn't develop a site before a certain year, then we could certainly do that. But we couldn't just do it for the sake of doing it. If that makes sense.
So Andrew, if I could just be absolutely clear. So this, just so we're all clear on this, and I think I am. So if we start allocating big new sites in this, not refresh, review is technically more correct, of the local plan, they could come forward within the current plan period, before, in other words, before 2031, because I think residents also ought to be clear on that point.
Yes, they could do. If we're talking about big sites, however, the number of completions that they would be able to produce every year would be relatively limited, I think. So a large, really big site, if you have, say, 2 or 3 builders on a site in one go, you might get sort of 200 to 250 completions per year off of that one site. So yes, they could start straight away, but there would still be a bit of a limiting factor as to how many completions could be completed per year. And
yeah, if I could just add, I mean that's one of the reasons why you would allocate a mixture of size of sites, because if you look at something like, for example, Harlem and Gilston, that has taken a large number of years to get to the point where they've had planning permission granted. So if you're looking at large scale developments, which we are exploring, you are more likely to end up with those not getting out of the ground for 5 years just because of the time it will take to get planning permission. So that there will be a natural degree of phasing from just having to go through the planning system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think the reality is that the smaller sites, should we put those in, some of those could come forward quite quickly. the larger sites there. So if you consider Straits Mill, I can't remember when the planning committee, I can't remember when we gave permission for that. How many years?
I think it's 2018.
Right, and that's, you know, still not happened. So the reality is, it's a good point to make, but I think the reality is the very large sites are going to be a while in the making. Yeah. Right. Anyone else on housing numbers? Nope. Okay, members, we have one recommendation, which is on page 11, that the local plan target for new homes in Braintree district is based on an annual minimum average of 1,115, with a view to identifying an additional 10% of this for the period 2026 to 2041, meaning an annual average of 1,227 new homes, and that site allocations are identified to provide a sufficient supply to meet that target at future meetings. Could I have somebody to move, please? Councillor Coleridge, thank you. And a second, somebody, Councillor Prime, and a show of hands for support, please. Thank you, members. Against? Abstention? Councillor Abbott, thank you. Right. Okay. Right, to move on to item 7, which is Alan again on the section 1 update. So this is interesting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So the current Section 1 local plan is a joint document between us, Colchester and Tendring. It includes policies on joint policies on housing, employment numbers, as well as a spatial strategy for North Essex. Following discussions with other officers from these authorities, it has been suggested that the Section 1 is no longer required. So we would be proposing to delete Section 1 of the plan and transfer any sort of strategic required policies through to a local plan, through to the Braintree local plan. So this would include the policies on overall housing numbers, employment numbers, the policy on recreation avoidance mitigation strategy, that sort of thing. Yes, it's quite a short presentation on that one, because we're essentially saying we're just going to be deleting the Section 1 plan and just incorporating or proposing to incorporate the strategic elements into the Section 2 local plan. Councillor Spray, that's all.
That's fine. Thank you, Alan. Right. Members, anybody want to make a comment? Councillor Abbott.
Well, I enthusiastically support this, Madam Chairman. I think, I'm going to say again, I think the last local plan, we got into a right old Horlicks, as we say in some parts of Essex, over this business of Part 1, Part 2 local plan. Pertaining to the point you made at your opening comments, it led to delays in us getting a local plan, and that led to speculative developers picking off sites around our villages against our own spatial strategy. So I think that we're dropping all that and concentrating on our own local plan is a benefit, and I shall be voting for this definitely. The only point additionally I'd make is, of course, we may be going back into something like this under local government reform somewhere down the line. We don't know what that's going to look like, although we've got some idea. But could officers on that point actually say any more about, have you heard any more about where we're going with that? Because I think the idea is that a new unitary authority would just sort of Lego brick the existing local plans, or would it be more complicated than that? Thank you.
Right, officers.
Yeah, I mean, what would happen is once we get the Braintree local plan adopted, it would be the local plan for the area within Braintree district that would be contained within the new unitary authority until the new unitary authority created its own local plan. So it would still be in effect up until 2041 or until replaced.
Just to add to that, in the case of other authorities that have been through unitary, so Buckinghamshire, when they went into local government reform in 2020, they got given a 5-year period with which to develop a new local plan for the unitary. So that was legislated. They're not meeting that timetable because of the complexity, but that was part of it's dealt with through legislation when the new unitary is sort of established in law.
Okay. Anyone else? Councillor Ritchie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to add some balance to the point that Councillor Abbott made, the point of Part 1 and Part 2 was to allow us to look with neighbouring authorities around the feasibility of delivering garden communities, which was the right thing to do, and had it have been approved, I'd be sat at home watching EastEnders with a cup of tea right now, because the housing numbers would have probably have met the sort of delivery numbers that we've been asking to do right now. So again, potatoes, difference of opinion. However, there was absolute sense in the Part 1, Part 2. Whilst there was some speculative developments in that intervening period, for the greater good, Part 1, Part 2 was feasibly the best thing to do at that time. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Ritchie. Councillor Cunningham.
And I think, again, we don't want to dwell too much on the history of the thing, but we mentioned earlier the ability for five-year housing supply and the deliverability and the developers having had planning permissions granted and not acting on it. So I think if we were to apportion complications and difficulties we may have had with planning, I think only a small percentage would have been to the local plan process. The rest of it would have been the standard underlying fault that we've had in this system of ours across the country for decades, and that is we have absolutely no ability to force the hand of developers once permissions are given. I think colleagues from all sides would probably acknowledge that, and I know they have done in recent years.
Thank you, Councillor Cunningham. Any other members? Councillor Abbott.
The reason it wasn't the right thing to do wasn't in the principle. You know, there is a principle to garden communities depending on scale. Silver End originally was started as a garden village. Is we were rejected first by the inspector, who said it wasn't viable, and there were lots of other warnings that it was not viable, but we persisted. I think that's the point, and we pushed forward and hit the buffers. And I think if we'd actually stopped at that first point and listened to what the administration had listened to a wide range of members and taken more interest in what the inspector said, we wouldn't have had what happened.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Abbott. I'm, as the chairman, I'm not going to make any further comment on that tonight, but anyway, yes, point noted. Anyone else? No? Okay. We have 3 recommendations on page 18. I will, for consistency, read them out, although I do a shortened version, and I'm not necessarily going to read the recommendations out for all of these papers going forward. You'll be pleased to hear, but I'll just do this one tonight. So that the current local plan section 1 is not carried forward into the new draft local plan, that the content of the following policies is updated and moved into an appropriate section of the section 2 local plan, SP2, SP4, SP5, SP6 and SP7, and that the contents of those policies are reviewed at the relevant local plan subcommittee. Could I have somebody to move, please? Councillor Abbott, I think you got him first. Seconder, Councillor Ritchie, and a show of hands, please. Thank you, members. That's unanimous. Good. Okay. So, we have no urgent business, either in public or private session this evening, so I will close the meeting at 10 minutes past 8. Thank you very much, members, and make the most of this relatively short meeting, because I suspect the next few will not be so, but thank you.